I wish to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on and recognise any other people or families with connection to the lands of the ACT and region. I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are listening today. Welcome to Safety Spotlight, a podcast from WorkSafe ACT. My name's Lish Fejer. Safety at work isn't just about avoiding physical and psychological injuries, it's also about the bottom line. Poor workplace safety can have significant financial consequences for employers, employees, and the broader economy overall. The economic impact from lost productivity, from work-related illness, injury, compensation costs, healthcare costs for individuals, the public health system, reputational damage, that's just some of the tangible costs. The knock-on effects of intangible costs are immeasurable. Investing in workplace safety not only keeps people safe at work and prevents these costs, but also creates a healthier, more productive work environment. What's not to love about that? Over the next hour, we'll be exploring this topic, and joining me with their expertise, Jacqui Agius, the ACT Work Health and Safety Commissioner, who's dedicated to improving workplace safety and compliance across the ACT. Hi, Jacqui.
Good morning. How are you? It's great to be back with you, Lish. One of the things I love about doing podcasts is I don't have to worry about how I look. And you might, actually you will know about the old saying, you know, I've got a good face for radio. Well, that's like me in podcasts. I've got a great face for podcasts. And you also know, but Helen might know, that first things in the morning and me do not go very well. And so having a podcast and not having to worry about getting up and being bright and healthy, I'm glad to be with you this morning. Not that any of that applies to both of you, because as usual, you both look amazing this morning.
Because my other lark this morning, we're meeting on a bright sunny day here in Canberra, is Professor Helen Lingard from RMIT University, an expert in construction worker safety. She started her career for a contracting organisation in the civil engineering construction sector. She's also the founder and director of the Construction Work Health and Safety Research Group, and has made significant contributions improving workplace wellbeing and injury prevention. Helen, good morning to you.
Morning, Lish. It's a pleasure to be here on this beautiful Canberra morning.
And welcome to Canberra. It's great to have you, Helen.
Thanks, Jacqui.
Our first podcast was on fatigue, and there was a number in that podcast just putting a figure on not managing one employee's fatigue, $1.2 million, I think it was. What are the hidden costs of cutting corners on safety? Do you hear this a lot in your work, Helen?
Yes, we do. I think the hidden costs are largely, they're difficult to measure because they are so wide-ranging. So as an example, if work is poorly planned and if people don't put enough time and energy into thinking through during the design and planning stages how construction work will be done, then what happens is that all sorts of problems can arise, both safety-wise, productivity-wise, but the quality of the work can be problematic. And that can lead to all sorts of challenges associated with rework. The thing about rework is that it can add up to 6% onto the contract value, which when companies are operating on a profit margin of maybe between 3 and 7%, that's a significant amount of cost to those companies. Rework is also problematic because when you have to go back and fix things up because you've got defects, then during that rework, research shows that people are 70% more likely to be injured in rework than in the initial construction activity. So, you know, if you look at the costs associated with that, both in terms of safety and in terms of the cost of defects, I think that there's a significant issue.
Let's go back onto the broader issue of why businesses might view safety measures as an unnecessary expense. For businesses, always the bottom line and making money comes first, and worker safety I'd hope to say. You'd hope to say, Jacqui, as well,
Well,
worker safety comes first before the bottom line.
I think everyone's going to expect me to say that, and that's exactly what I'm going to say today, that safety should come before everything. And it's quite interesting because when a business is being set up, there are three things from a financial perspective that they will need to consider initially, and that is their legal obligations, their financial obligations, and their strategic priorities. When we're talking about safety, we're talking about legal obligations. So we're not talking about a choice here, we're talking about a requirement. And for some reason, not sure why, people always forget the safety component when they're setting up a business. And when we talk about safety by design, which I know, Helen, you really support, then we should be talking about safety at the forefront of setting up that business. But there are, going back to the hidden costs, and before I talk financially, I just want to talk about the moral costs of potentially destroying someone's life and their family's life if we're not doing safety. And I have spoken to PCBUs, and that is persons conducting a business or undertaking, who have injured or killed a worker in their workplace. And one of the things that they say is, I never thought this would happen to me on my site. And they are not considering actually the impact on themselves and their own families, let alone the impact on the worker. But when we talk about those hidden costs, we're talking about the cost of increased incident rates. We're talking about the brand and the reputation and the cost of that. Operational disruptions, retraining and recruiting. And we know, and Helen, you and I were talking about this earlier this week, at the cost of needing to employ someone because we're unable to retain our workers in the workplace because we're not doing safety well. And of course, insurance premiums. And I am a PCBU, and I'm pleased to say that actually this year my premiums for workers' compensation have gone down. And so you can, if you do safety well, you can actually, not only are there financial benefits, but you're saving money.
Helen, do you want to add to that, the money savings? Do people look at it as an expense? Do businesses initially look at safety as an expense that they can cut?
I think in an industry like construction, which is the industry in which I work, there are sort of systematic kind of pressures or systemic pressures that lead people to think in that way. And I'm thinking about, the competitive tendering system where contracts are often awarded with price being a key kind of consideration in deciding who to give work to. That's actually problematic because when you see that happening between, say, a client and a head contractor, and then the head contractor applies that same principle in the selection of their subcontractors right down to the lower levels of the supply chain, then that can, incentivize or lead people to think that cutting corners is actually an issue around, being able to win work. In fact, the problem with that thinking is that we're seeing increasingly now client organisations actually looking at good safety performance as being a requirement of the people who they or the organisations they engage to deliver projects for them. So in fact, thinking that cutting corners with regard to health and safety is a good business survival strategy is actually not very sensible because it will ultimately reduce your ability to tender for and be awarded future work as responsible clients are increasingly looking at health and safety performance as a requirement.
And that's a really good, beg your pardon, Lish. I was just to say that's a really good point because in the ACT, and we're seeing more around other jurisdictions, that in the ACT there's a 30% safety component when they're looking at procurement, ACT government procurement. So they're considering, do you have a good safety track record when they're deciding who to issue contracts to? And the point I want to make about that is it's not always cheaper to choose the cheapest quote in a tender because it can cost you more money in the long run in relation to what you were talking about, Helen, which are those defects and time lost and, all of those things.
All those knock-on effects of having even one worker removed with an injury, not just the lost time and productivity, but then that knowledge that has gone with them. They might be the only person that can do one particular role within a site, and then feeling it's an immense issue from just one component of.
Yeah, exactly. And one of our regulatory tools is the prohibition notice and the non-disturbance notice. So when an incident occurs on site, and if it is a serious incident where we are considering looking at investigation, we will go in and issue a non-disturbance notice. That means you cannot disturb the site or that area of the site, and that can be in place for a period of time while we are investigating that. But then there's also, on top of that, the prohibition notice, which will be you're prohibited from carrying out this activity until you fix these things. And that's a day. I don't know, Helen, whether there's ever been a cost on a construction site for a day lost in time.
Look, I'm not aware, and certainly my research hasn't looked at that, but I do know that there are, people who've considered all the different elements of costs associated with the disruption of a major safety incident. And it includes, bringing in new equipment, repairing damaged equipment, replacing damaged materials. It includes, even the less tangible things like, the loss of morale and the relationship between the employer and the workforce. And I think, the costs are very, very consequential.
Let's move on to industry-specific safety impacts. Helen, you come with a strong construction industry background. Jacqui, you've worked across the sectors here in the ACT. How does failing to prioritise safety directly affect the bottom line in residential construction, healthcare, education, commercial construction? Can we have a look at each of those? Helen, we might start with you, with the construction industry.
Yeah, well, as we've just said, certainly in residential construction, any incidents can cause significant delays and impact your project timeline. That obviously has financial repercussions. It includes investigations following the incident, safety inspections, the time needed to repair damaged materials, equipment, morale, productivity, and those sorts of things. And that's the real problem in the residential sector, where people are needing to have their homes built. In commercial construction, again, going back to the tendering for government contracts, there's a really strong emphasis now on safety, and tenderers have to, by way of trying to win work, demonstrate robust safety management systems, commitment to safe working practices and project-specific safety criteria. And certainly as part of that sort of tendering and contract selection process that we're seeing in government contracts, enforcement activity is carefully scrutinised. So the level, nature and seriousness of any enforcement activity that a contractor's experience will be considered, as will their workers' compensation requirements. So, for example, work in Victoria, I can speak for, but in workers' compensation premiums are looked at compared to the industry averages, and that's factored into the consideration about the suitability of a particular company to win a particular project. So, these are things which really seriously impact, if you like, the business performance of construction companies in the commercial sector and the infrastructure sectors.
I want to pick up on that one, if you don't mind, Helen. So one of the things as the regulator that our inspectors are often faced with, because of the procurement requirements around safety now, please don't issue me a notice because this is a tick against my name when it comes to me procuring for ACT government work or government work. And my answer to that is, well, if you didn't breach the Work Health and Safety Act in the first place, you wouldn't be getting a notice. So keep your workplace safe, and then you're going to avoid notices rather than blaming the regulator for doing what is our role, which is to regulate safety in your workplace.
What are some of the biggest things you see on, say a residential construction site, the safety breaches?
Oh, wow, this is, the same ones that we have been talking about for years and years and years, and that's why it gets absolutely frustrating for us as the regulator. And it's not just in the ACT. Helen will be familiar with all of these. We're talking about fall from heights. And, I'll give you an example. One of my inspectors went out a few weeks ago to a site. They issued an infringement notice because there were workers on the roof and their harnesses were in their ute. And 2 weeks later, same PCBU, same workers on a roof, harnesses in the ute.
And break that down as to why that happens. That's not, it's a cost-cutting measure to a degree. It's a time-saving measure. It might be also a bit of masculinity at play. I can do this, I'm safe. How do you address that?
Personally, I think it's actually a supervision issue as well. I think, work sites need to be well supervised. And I think one of the challenges in some sectors of the industry is maybe the supervision is not so rigorous. And I think, if you're constantly seeing people doing the same things and breaking the same rules, it sounds to me like a supervision issue.
Is it across all those sectors? Healthcare, Jacqui, here in the ACT and across Australia, staffing shortages across the healthcare industry doesn't just affect the workers, but then the people they are looking after.
Yeah, so healthcare is a really interesting one, and in the ACT, healthcare and social assistance has the highest number of workplace injuries out of any industry in the ACT. It has even overtaken the construction industry here, which is an absolutely new thing. One of the reasons for that could be on the back of COVID, because we know that during COVID our healthcare workers were dealing with really difficult situations, and we know that healthcare workers will keep going essentially until they drop because they care about their patients. It's a bit like education, they care about their students, so they'll work and work and work and work. So COVID ends, they've done this amazing work to keep our community going, and that's when they start to fall apart. So we expected that might happen. We think it is, but obviously, there's some more research to do there. But in the ACT, there were 359 workers' compensation claims for serious injuries, and serious injuries are those where you're having 5 or more days off work, and that was in the healthcare and social assistance industry. There's also an expanding population in the ACT, so we know our healthcare system is under pressure and strain at the moment because our population is increasing. So we can't afford to have healthcare workers off sick and injured and on workers' comp. We actually need to be ensuring that we're doing that proactive safety. And you may have seen that we have recently issued some improvement notices and prohibition notices in the healthcare industry, and we're working with the healthcare providers in the ACT to improve some of those safety breaches.
You mentioned, Jacqui, education. How does it impact education, the costs for schools, universities?
Well, when we're talking about education, we're talking about not only the reputational damage and the potential impact on the students, but staff shortages in education, particularly when we're having shortages around the country for teachers, is a real problem. And in the ACT, one of the things that education unions are talking about is the collapsing of classes because there aren't enough staff to cover the teaching, and there are some real problems there. It's impacting on the future of our society because education is so important, as we know, and we love our teachers for the amazing work they do. But I talk about and have used before that analogy of being on an aeroplane. And when we sit on an aeroplane and we are told to put the oxygen mask on ourselves before we help anyone next to us, we all accept that. It's universal language. But for some reason, when we talk about healthcare and education, we forget that. And we don't think about the fact that if we put our teachers and our healthcare and our educators and our healthcare workers first, if we look after them, then they will do a better job at teaching and caring for their patients.
At this time when the labour force is so stretched and people are so stretched, are there many levers for some sectors to pull change that?
Yeah, so I know in universities, for instance, and you know, Helen working at RMIT may want to speak to this. They're looking towards online classes and they're doing more and more online as a cost-cutting measure. I'm not sure about, and again, I'll defer to Helen on this, on the educational cost of running education services in that way.
Yeah, I think the online classes is an interesting one because there is actually a counter-argument to that would say that a lot of our students now want flexible learning options, and many of them are in paid employment, and they're in paid employment in order to sustain themselves through their university study, and therefore, you know, having flexible options, i.e. some online options and hybrid options, actually allows them to engage in paid employment and also engage in study at the same time, whereas, you know, a requirement to come to class would not. So I think it is actually it's a bit of a complex issue, that one.
And that's why we can't put a cost on what it costs businesses to not adhere to workplace safety.
No, I don't think you can put a cost. It's actually unquantifiable, but the same issues apply that we spoke about, those hidden costs, the workers' compensation. But in education and healthcare, we've got that additional cost of patient care and educative services.
Helen, you've worked in this space for a very long time. Have you got a case study of how this has played out?
Yeah, so a few years ago we did a study where we used wearable sensors to measure the risk associated with doing various construction tasks. And one of the tasks we looked at was when people were breaking down the tops of concrete piles in order to put the superstructure on top of those piles. And they were using a jackhammer, two men using jackhammers to break these concrete piles down. It was taking them 5 hours to break down one concrete pile. And all the while they were doing that, they were at risk of musculoskeletal injury. They were at risk of, there was dust exposure, noise exposure, vibration, and they were holding these jackhammers horizontally to chip away at these piles for hours on end. And there are alternative ways of doing that. There are pneumatic and also chemical braking methods that can be used to do that work, whereby you can work much more efficiently and productively using other mechanical or chemical methods, and you don't need to be standing holding a jackhammer for 5 hours.
Would the businesses have explored those options, or they just went straight to the human option?
I think possibly not. I think when those options are, when people know about those options and they've looked at the benefits of those options, I think companies are open to using them. But because they're not widely used, I think there is actually tends to be a default to old school ways of doing things.
And also, I'm giving someone a job rather than giving them an injury.
Potentially, and also it might be that the distribution of costs is different. So it might be that you have to spend a little bit more money up front investing in some of these technological solutions, whereas, if the alternative is it might look cheaper to have people doing it. But in terms of actually having people doing that work, it's probably in the long term not as productive, probably poorer quality outcomes, and ultimately not very sustainable if you're harming people in the process.
And on that example, Helen, the people doing that jackhammering job, breaking that down, that injury mightn't present itself for decades to come.
Yeah.
So how do you quantify that cost?
Well,
if
that
it never is claimed?
Look, that is a really serious issue for the construction industry, because we do know studies have shown that up to 2/3 of workers retire early because their bodies are damaged. They've got work disability or injury that prevents them from continuing to work. Now, when you've got an industry that's currently going through a massive skills shortage, with huge amounts of demand in relation to new homes required to be built, infrastructure projects, transport, hospitals, schools, all of those things that need to be constructed, and we've got a shortage of workers as it is, you don't really want people retiring early because they're injured. We also know young people don't really want to join the industry because they're put off by the fact that the industry is perceived to be, dirty, dangerous, and tough. Very long hour culture, the worst performing industry in terms of gender diversity and women's representation. So we know young workers. We've done studies of Gen Z workers who've indicated that their priorities for joining the industry are whether they'll have a healthy lifestyle, whether they'll have work hours that match their personal life aspirations, and also whether they'll work in a gender equal and diverse and fair workplace. And where they perceive that's not going to be the case, they're likely to choose not to join.
You're speaking my language, Helen. I love it.
Yeah,
Really, really important that we look after our vulnerable workers in our workplaces. And I'm actually getting a bit tired of the question that I'm constantly asked about young workers. And I'm constantly asked whether or not our younger generations are willing to work. I don't think it's about that. And I think thank you, young workers, for speaking up, because, we've slogged ourselves working throughout our lives, and there needs to be that work-life balance. It's really important.
Can we put a cost on it, a dollar figure on what it costs Australia for work-related injuries and illnesses?
Well, Safe Work Australia have put out some figures on this, and if you really want to have a look, go on. They've got some amazing resources. But what they say is there were 6.9 million work-related injuries and illnesses that occurred between 2008 to 2018, an average of 623,663 cases each year, and this caused a 2.2 million full-time equivalent productivity loss between 2008 to 2018. And on top of this, 37.6 billion in costs were incurred by the health system because of those injuries.
It's just the cost incurred to the health system. That's extraordinary. Okay, so what is it? What's your response to business owners who say they can't afford to implement stronger safety measures, or just the ones that should be in place?
Look, I'd start by saying safety should not be overly expensive or too onerous. I've been on work sites where risk assessments and safe work method statements are 200 and 300 pages long. And Helen's doing an amazing research project at the moment, which WorkSafe ACT are involved in decluttering safety systems. Imagine what it would be like for a worker to come onto a site and have to get through 200 or 300 pages of safety. It's impossible. And so we're making it too complicated. And there are some simple ways of doing safety. And the points that I'd make about that is show your commitment to safety by consulting with your workers. It's so important. The people doing the work know best what the hazards are and will have solutions for those hazards. It's the easiest way to do safety. And the other thing that I would say is learn how to do a risk assessment, because a risk assessment can be done really quickly in consultation with your workers, and you'll be surprised in most instances the sorts of controls that the workers will be able to recommend to you around those safety things. None of that costs any money. It's free. So use your internal resourcing.
And they're not always costly solutions. I mean, a few years ago, we did a study where we used a technique called participatory video, where we got workers, or worked with an organisation who were engaging workers in making videos about how they were working and actually describing how they were working in the process of making these videos. And in one example, they were erecting a scaffold according to the standard operating procedure that they'd used to erect this kind of scaffold for many, many years. And they realised that there was one step in the process where there was an unprotected edge where somebody could potentially fall. And the workers themselves created, in the process of making the video, an alternative erection sequence that solved that problem. And it's a really good example of how it didn't cost a great deal. It took half an hour for them to try a couple of different ways and work out a better way of doing it, which the company then documented and used in a revised operating procedures. So I think you're absolutely right, Jacqui. I think the opportunities to learn from the workforce and in particular identify those areas of clutter, the things that companies do that take a lot of time and energy and resources that really aren't contributing any value to reduction of risk or improving operational safety. And there's so
What are
many.
some of those?
Oh, well, as Jacqui mentioned, there's overly long documentation, but there's processes that are redundant, forms people fill out that nobody ever looks at. Duplication of training, where people have to go through the same training multiple times and they're not learning anything new from it. It's just a redundancy in the systems.
And overcomplicated processes.
Yes, yeah, overcomplicated processes and overly bureaucratic processes unnecessarily.
And this probably gives workplace safety a bad name, but people get workplace safety training and they go, oh, groan, and universal groan that goes out. Well, without turning on that actually this means that I will be looked after in my workplace and I'll go home safe.
Well, it breeds a cynicism, because if people see it as a paper-based exercise, that's not to them helping them at all. And so people can become very cynical and disengaged. But importantly, it's also, I mentioned supervision earlier, it's taking supervisors from the front line where they need to be supervising the work and engaging them in other activities which may not actually be helpful.
Does having a strong safety record attract workers to a business, do you think, Helen, in your experience with construction?
Yeah, I think it does. So I've been part of an initiative recently called the Culture in Construction Initiative. And as part of that, we've been working with government agencies and large construction companies and the Australian Constructors Association to try and change the culture of the industry. And the culture, we've developed a culture standard which has been trialled on 5 projects in Victoria and New South Wales. And my team have researched the implementation of this culture standard. What's come out of that is that the culture standard tries to address 3 things: health and well-being, gender diversity and equality, and time for life. So the things that I mentioned earlier. What's really interesting is that the pilot projects where there's been a very conscious effort to improve the culture around these things has actually we've seen workers attracted to those projects because they want to work under this new kind of cultural environment and requirements. And so I think it's not just about the physical safety aspects. It's actually about the culture of projects. So we know that women in the construction industry experience very high levels of sexual harassment. We've just again done a piece of research on women in the New South Wales construction industry, and our survey showed 65% of the women who completed the survey had experienced some form of sexual harassment. Now, women are not going to want to join an industry where they're exposed to that kind of behaviour and that kind of experience. So I do think workers, will join industries where they're going to feel safe and looked after, and will not want to join industries where they feel threatened or likely to be harmed.
And last year I was speaking to a electrical company in the ACT run by women, and the reason that they formed their own electrical business was because they felt so unsafe in the industry. They loved working as electricians, that they formed a women's company. And we're seeing that more and more. And I know there's also a women's construction company in the ACT. We're seeing women going out and forming their own companies so that they can be safe and control the safety of their own employees on work sites.
So the costs of neglecting work health and safety, can we look at some case studies of how it's impacted a business? Say here in the ACT, Jacqui, can you share some real-world examples of where safety failures have cost a business?
Well, I can in relation to fines and prosecutions, which by the time a prosecution occurs, then, recently we had a case in the ACT where a business was fined. The starting point was $300,000 reduced to $225,000 for a safety breach. But as Helen and I were speaking earlier this week, Helen spoke about the research of Andrew Hopkins, which I think is really important that we note.
Yeah. So look, while I know there's no doubt that incidents cost companies in fines and increased compensation costs and so on, I do think we've got to be a bit cautious about expecting that that's going to be enough to motivate them to do health and safety better. So Andrew Hopkins, for example, has done some excellent work, and he cautions against relying on using the costs of safety incidents as a motivator for managers to take safety seriously. And his argument is that often they only see the direct costs. They don't see, if you like, the total costs. And because they don't see all of those costs, and they may not even if they do see some of the direct costs, they may not always act in their own economic self-interest. He suggests that, in fact, there are much stronger motivators and more useful motivators that can drive a focus on workers' health and safety. And they're things to do with, having good values in your company and a sense of what's morally right. And those sorts of drivers are likely to produce a much more consistent and reliable managerial focus on safety than simply always appealing to the cost element of it.
And I often think, yes, we speak about finances, but really it's that personal human cost that is unquantifiable that people will carry for their entire lives. So families and the other workers on the site who witness an injury. Yeah. Like we're talking like so many flow-on effects by a worker being injured on site. I mentioned earlier about the cost to the economy in relation to workers' comp. And Safe Work Australia in 2022 put out some research and a report, and it was the Safer, Healthier, Wealthier, the economic value of reducing work-related injuries and illnesses. And one of the things that they say is in the absence of work-related injuries and illnesses, Australia's economy would have been $28.6 billion larger each year. In addition, there would have been 185,500 additional jobs every year, and more than 2/3 of these jobs are for the skilled workforce if we didn't have those injuries and illnesses. And so if there had been no work-related injuries and illnesses between 2008 and 2018, the Australian economy would have been substantially better off, and Australians would have had access to more and better jobs and would have been rewarded with higher wages. So WHS is critical to Australian productivity and prosperity, and I know that Helen, going back to Andrew Hopkins' studies around, the motivation for doing safety, that we can't always use those hidden costs. But if people actually sat down and thought about that for a minute, just a second even, then the contribution that doing safety right would make to the Australian economy is so significant.
How much does the she'll be right attitude play into it, though? The not ever contemplating that something bad will go wrong? I mean, here in the ACT, you have identified non-compliance across work sites constantly. I wonder what are the common ones and the reasons for them?
There are lots of reasons for people not doing safety, and some of those reasons can be exactly what you referred to. It'll be right, and we'll get this done quickly. We won't set up. It'll take us more time to set up this safety system, and that can be about individuals taking risks, but as we know, there are obligations in the Work Health and Safety Act for everybody and duties for everybody, including workers.
But we're talking financial today and the cost to the business financially.
Are you trying to put me on the spot here, Lish?
About those non-compliant things, just literally issuing a non-compliance notice, how's it impacted the business? Is there any case study you can draw on there for that one?
Well, I can tell you, not specifically about case studies, but I can say that so far this year, the ACT Magistrate Court has issued nearly $1 million in fines to businesses who have breached the Work Health and Safety Act, and we currently have another 16 matters before the court, and the investigation team is currently has 36 other investigations underway. And these fines are becoming more and more significant as we're seeing jurisdictions around Australia put more emphasis on the requirement to do safety and do safety well.
That's just the fine. Do fines make people act?
Well, we're not seeing, I can honestly say that in the residential construction space in the ACT, we're not seeing huge improvements in relation to behaviour because of the fines that we're issuing. And I know that ACT government are currently talking about whether or not we need to be issuing higher fines in this space. And certainly here in WorkSafe ACT, we're talking about we're looking at risk-based prosecution more and more, so that rather than waiting for an injury or fatality to occur, that we prosecute the business prior to the incident occurring because of the breach. And certainly that's what we should be doing in work health and safety.
I think I'd add to that, though. I think it's one thing to talk about the costs of fines when something's gone wrong. But I'd like to turn that on its head and say we also need to look at the costs of doing work safely, generally. And in the construction industry, certainly, I think, a lot of, if more effort is put into the planning and the design of healthy and safe work practices and processes, then we can avoid a lot of incidents. And it's not necessarily even about, funding things that we would necessarily think of as standalone safety costs. It's actually about designing better work, using better technologies.
Okay, let's do that. Yeah. Let's go into how our business can create that design.
So my observation is that a lot of companies implement quite expensive safety initiatives with little or no evidence that they're actually going to make a difference. And I think when you're deciding as a company what to invest in, it's important to consider whether there's reliable and valid evidence as to how effective those things are going to be, what they're going to cost you, and then what they potentially are going to save you. So I think looking at that, and there are tools. For example, Workplace Health and Safety Queensland have a tool on their website that can help organisations to really better understand the return on investment associated with some of the safety initiatives that they might think about doing.
So if business owners, anyone listening today, can take away one financial lesson or a couple about safety, what should it be?
Well, my comment is that the motivation to do safety shouldn't really be to save money, because there's a legal and moral responsibility, as Jacqui mentioned, to protect workers from harm. But I do think that investing in designing work well has economic benefits for organisations in terms of improvements in safety, but also improvements in quality worker engagement and productivity. And a key to achieving that, I think, is consulting the workforce well.
What I would say is, if you're unsure about safety, seek some expert advice, because we know that businesses, if they have a legal or employment matter, they'll get a lawyer. If they have a financial matter, they'll speak to an accountant or a financial advisor. And if they are looking for what insurance they need to get to start their business, they'll speak to an insurance broker. But people are not thinking about safety as part of that planning that business. And that's, some of the stuff that Helen was just speaking about. If you have a safety issue, get a safety expert. And in the long run, of course, that's going to be cheaper, but we have to remember that work health and safety is risk-based. It's meant to be preventative, not reactive. What that means, being preventative, is that we control the risk before it occurs rather than waiting for the risk to eventuate before we do something about it.
Businesses want to find more information on where to get a safety consultant, work health and safety requirements. Where should they go?
Well, I would say be very careful and make sure that you, when you're engaging professional advice in health and safety, to actually look at evaluation studies, look at the evidence, at the evidence. How reliable and valid is the evidence that something is going to work? Because I think there's a risk that you can buy a solution that may not be evidence informed. So, I think evaluation studies are really important.
Or buy a solution that's 1,000 pages long that no one's going to get their head around. And
so from small business, sole traders, small business, big business, government, across the board, everybody has to have it in place.
Yeah, and start at your regulators' websites. I mean, there's so much stuff on there for free.
They're the pitch for WorkSafe ACT.
It just doesn't cost anything. But, I would say make safety part of your business plan and build it into your priorities. Safety must be a priority and part of your business model. Our people are our most valuable resource. They are our children, our siblings, our lovers, our families and our friends. This is the most cost-effective thing that you can do.
I think that's a wonderful place to end. Thank you both for your expertise and sharing with us today. And thanks for joining us on the WorkSafe ACT podcast, Safety Spotlight. Follow us on all the usual channels and keep listening. Stay safe.
Yeah, you too, and great to be with you both.
Thanks, you too.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Jacqui.